Morning. Page 397. Sorry. That is how many obstacles and pitfalls there were in the path of escape. But the desperate heart sometimes does not weigh things. It saw the river was flowing, and a log was floating down it, and one jump, you float on down. Vyacheslav Bezrodny from the Olshan camp, barely released from the hospital, still utterly weak, escaped down the Indigirka River on two logs fastened together to the Arctic Ocean. Where was he going? And what was he hoping for? In the end, he was not so much caught as picked up on the open sea and returned over the winter road to Olchan to the very same hospital. It is not possible to say for everyone who didn't return to camp on his own, who's not brought in half alive, or who's not brought in dead, that he had escaped. Perhaps he had only exchanged an involuntary and long drawn-out death in camp for the free death of a beast in the taiga. To the degree that the fugitives didn't so much escape as merely wander around and return on their own, the camp security chiefs even derived benefits from them. Without any strain, they would wrap another term around them, and if no escapes took place for a long time, they arranged provocations. Some stoolie or other was given instructions to set up an escape group, and all of them would be arrested. But a man who seriously undertook to escape became very swiftly fearsome. Some of them set fire to the taiga behind them in order to get the dogs off their trail, and it would burn for weeks over dozens of miles. In 1949, on a meadow near the Veslyanka State Farm, a fugitive was detained with human flesh in his knapsack. He had killed an unconvoyed artist with a 5-year term who had crossed his path. He had cut his flesh off. He had not yet had the chance to cook it. In the spring of 1947, in the Kolyma, near Elgin, 2 convoy guards were leading a column of Zeks, and suddenly one Zek, without any prior agreement with anyone, skillfully attacked the convoy guards on his own, disarmed them, and shot them both. His name is unknown, but he turned out to have been a recent frontline officer, a rare and bright example of a frontline soldier who had not lost his courage in camp. The bold fellow announced to the column that it was free, but the prisoners were overwhelmed with horror. No one followed his lead, and they all sat down right there and waited for a new convoy. The frontline officer shamed them, but in vain, and then he took up the rifles, 32 cartridges, 31 for them, and left alone. He killed and wounded several pursuers, and with his 32nd cartridge, he shot himself. The entire archipelago might well have collapsed if all former frontliners had behaved as he did. In Krasleg, a former soldier, a hero of the Khalkhin Gol, attacked a convoy guard with an axe, stunned him with the butt, took his rifle and 30 cartridges. Dogs were sent after him. He killed 2 of them and wounded the dog trainer. When they caught him, they didn't just shoot him, but went crazy and avenged themselves and their dogs, riddling the corpse with their bayonets and leaving it to lie that way for a week by the gatehouse. In 1951, in that same cross lake, some 10 long-termers were being convoyed by 4 infantrymen among the guards. Suddenly, the Czechs attacked the convoy, took away their automatic weapons, put on their uniforms, but they had mercy on the soldiers. The oppressed were often more magnanimous than the oppressors, and 4 of them, convoying with the braggadocio, conducted their comrades to the narrow gauge railroad. There was an empty car there, ready for timber. The false convoy went up to the locomotive and forced the crew to disembark. One of them was a locomotive engineer. They drove the train at full speed to the Rishadi station on the trunk line of the Trans-Siberian, but they had about 40 miles to cover, and meanwhile, they had already been reported, starting with the guards they'd spared. Several times they had to shoot their way past groups of guards, and the track in front of them, up on the track in front of them. Several times they had to shoot their way past groups of guards, and several miles before Rishadi, the authorities succeeded in mining the track in front of them and put a battalion of camp guards into position. All the fugitives perished in the unequal battle. The quiet escapes were usually more fortunate than their results. Some of them were surprisingly successful, but we rarely hear these happy stories. Those who broke out do not give interviews. They have changed their names, and they are in hiding. Kusakov Stechinsky, who escaped successfully in 1942, tells his story now only because he was caught in 1959, after 17 years. And we have learned of the successful escape of Zinaida Yakovlevna Polovyaeva, because in the end it fell through. She got her term because she had stayed on as a teacher in her school during the German occupation, but she was not immediately arrested when the Soviet armies arrived, and before her arrest she was married to a pilot. Then she was married and sent to mine number 8 in Vorkuta. Through some Chinese working in the kitchen, she established communication with Freedom and with her husband. He was employed in civil aviation and arranged a trip to Vorkuta for himself. On an appointed day, Zina went to the bath in the work zone, where she had shed her camp clothing and released her hair, which had been curled up the night before, from under her headscarf. Her husband was waiting for her in the work sector. There were security officers on duty at the river ferry, but they paid no attention to a girl with curly hair who was arm in arm with a flyer. They flew out on a plane. Zina spent 1 year living on false papers, but she couldn't resist the desire to see her mother again, and her mother was under surveillance. Under new interrogation, she managed to convince them she had escaped in a coal car, and they never did find out about her husband's participation. Honorable. In 1946, Janis L. walked from his camp in Perm to Latvia, speaking fractured Russian the whole way and barely able to explain himself. His departure from camp was simple. He sprinted, broke through a rickety fence, and stepped over it. But later, in a swampy forest, with bast sandals on his feet, he had to live for a long time on berries alone. One day he managed to take a village cow off into the woods and kill it. He ate his fill of beef and managed to make himself some primitive shoes from the cow's hide. In another place he stole sheepskin from a peasant, a fugitive to whom the inhabitants are hostile, unwillingly becomes the inhabitant's enemy. In populated places, L. claimed to be a Latvian conscript who had lost his documents, and although the universal inspection of passes had not yet been abolished in that year, in Leningrad, which to him was a strange city, He managed, without uttering a word, to get to the Warsaw station and to walk another 2.5 miles along the tracks and board a train there. But there was one thing L was firmly assured of. When he got to Latvia, he would be fearlessly hidden, and that, of course, gave point to his escape. The kind of escape L undertook required a peasant's dexterity, grasp, and energy. But what about a city dweller? Yes, an old man at that, sentenced to 5 years for repeating an anecdote. Was he capable of escaping? It turns out that he was, when a more certain death was the only outcome of staying in his own camp, a small camp between Moscow and Gorky, for non-political offenders on their last legs, which had been manufacturing shells since 1941. Well, 5 years was a child's term, you might say, but the unfortunate anecdote teller would not have lasted out even 5 months if he was driven out to work without being fed. This escape was a gesture of despair, a brief impulse for which there would have been neither the judgment nor the strength half a minute later. A routine train had been shunted into the camp and loaded with shells, and a convoy sergeant came marching along it, followed by railroadmen who had fallen several cars behind. The sergeant opened the door of each red cattle car and checked to be sure no one was in there, then shut the door. The railroadmen put a seal on it, and our ill-starred sergeant and our ill-starred, famished last legger of an anecdote teller behind the back of the sergeant, who had gone on past and in front of the railroadmen, scrambled into a car. It was not easy for him to clamber up, and it was not easy to push the door back noiselessly, and it was all very impractical. It was a sure failure, and he closed the door behind him, with his heart skipping a beat. He was already sorry he had started. The sergeant would return and would kick him with his boots, and at any moment now the railroadman would shout. Already someone was touching the door. It was the railroadman putting on the seal, and I myself think maybe a good railroadman saw him and pretended not to. The train moved off, out of the compound. The train moved off to the front. The fugitive was unprepared. He didn't even have a piece of bread. In the course of 3 days, he would almost certainly die in his moving voluntary punishment cell. He wouldn't get to it. He wouldn't get to the front, and it wasn't the front he needed. What was he to do? How could he save himself now? He saw that the shell boxes were packed with a steel band around them. With his naked, defenseless hands, he tore that steel ribbon, and with it sawed through the floor of the railroad car, in a place where there weren't any boxes. This was impossible for an old man, but was it possible to die? And if they opened it and caught him, was it that possible? Furthermore, the boxes had wire loops attached to them to carry them. Cut off the loops, and out of them he made a similar, but much larger, loops, and tied them so that they hung down through the crawl hole he had cut. How exhausted he was, how hard it was to get his torn hands to do what he wanted them to do, how dearly that repeated anecdote was costing him. He didn't wait for his station, but carefully let himself down through the hole while the train was in motion, and lay with both feet in one loop near the rear of the train, and his shoulders in another. The train moved on, and the fugitive hung suspended there, rocking back and forth. The speed slackened, and at the moment he decided to let go, he dropped his feet, and his feet dragged along, and dragged the rest of him down. This was a sure death act, a circus act, but after all, they might send a telegram after the train and search the cars. After all, they would have missed him in the camp compound by now. He should not straighten out. He could not raise his head. He clung to the ties. He closed his eyes, ready for death. The accelerated clicking of the last cars, the lovely silence. The fugitive opened his eyes and rolled over. He could see what was the red light of the departing train. Freedom. But that was not yet salvation. Freedom was freedom, but he had neither documents nor money. He was dressed in camp rags, and he was doomed. Swollen and torn, somehow he managed to get to a station, and there he mingled with the recently arrived Leningrad train. Evacuated semi-corpses were being led by the hand and fed hot food at the station. But that would not have saved him either, except that the trainee found a dying friend and took his documents, and he knew all about his past too. They were all sent to a place near Saratov, and for several years, until the war was over, he lived there on a poultry farm. And then he was seized with a longing to see his daughter and went off to find her. He looked for her in Nalchik, in Armavir, and he found her in Uzhgorod. During this time, she had married a border guard. She had believed her father happily dead and buried, and now she listened to his story with horror and revulsion. Although she was quite devout in her civic conscientiousness, she nevertheless retained shameful vestiges of kinship, and she did not denounce her father, but merely drove him from her door. There were no other relatives of the old man left. He lived a meaningless existence, wandering like a nomad from city to city. He became a dope addict. In Baku, he smoked hashish and was picked up by an ambulance, and while under the influence of the drug, gave his right name, though when he came to, he gave the name under which he had been living. It was one of our Soviet hospitals, which certainly couldn't treat him without first establishing his identity. A comrade was summoned from state security, and in 1952, 10 years after his escape, the old man got 25 years. It was this that gave him the happy chance to tell his own story in prison cells, and thus to enter history. Sometimes the subsequent life of a successful fugitive was more dramatic than the escape itself. That is how it must have been. Sergei Andreevich Ch14, who has already been mentioned more than once in this book. In 1914, he became an employee of the Chinese Eastern Railroad, the KVZHD. In February 1917, he became a Bolshevik. In 1929, during the period of the KVZHD hostilities, he was imprisoned in a Chinese prison, and in 1931, he and his wife, Elena Prokofyevna, and his sons, Gennady and Victor, returned to their homeland. Their fatherland then operated in its usual way. Within a few days, he himself was arrested, his wife went insane, his sons were turned over to different orphanages, and were given new patronymics and surnames, even though they well remembered their own and objected. At first, Ch14 was given only 3 years, but the Far Eastern Troika of the OGPU, another Troika, remember that 3-person trial, 3-judge trial, 3-12. Because of their experience, he was seized again, tortured, and resentenced to 10 years without the right of correspondence. What was there for him to write about now? And even confinement under intensified guard during the revolutionary holidays. The severity of this sentence unexpectedly helped him. In 1934, he was moved to GULag, where he worked on building a railroad to Mointy. While there, during the May holidays of 1936, he was confined in the penalty isolator, and they threw him in with the free employee Avtanom Vasilyevich Chupin, under the same conditions as himself. Whether he was drunk or sober isn't clear, but at any rate, Ch14 managed to filch his 3-month identification certificate, which had expired 6 months earlier, and which had been issued by his village Soviet. The certificate virtually obliged him to escape, and on May 8th, Ch14 left the Mointy camp dressed in civilian clothes, without a scrap of camp clothing on him or with him, and with 2 half-liter bottles in his pockets like a typical drunk, except that they held not vodka, but water. Ahead of him stretched the salty march step. Twice he fell into the hands of Kazakhs who were on their way to work on the railroad, but since he knew little Kazakh, I played on their religious feelings and they let me go. at the western edge of Lake Balkhash. He was detained by security operations post of GULag. Taking his document, they asked him to give all sorts of information about himself and his relatives, and the supposed Japan answered correctly from memory. Here again he had a lucky accident. Without such lucky accidents, people probably get caught. The head of the operations group came into the dugout, and Japan beat him to the draw. "Hey, Nikolai, how are you? Don't you recognize me?" This split-second calculation was based on facial wrinkles and a contest in remembering faces. "I recognize you all right. But if you recognize me, I'm a goner." "No, I don't recognize you." "Well, how about that? We were traveling on a train together. Your name's Nadyunev. And you were telling me how you met Olya at the station in Sverdlovsk. You met in a train compartment, and after that you got married. It was all true." Nadyunev was astonished. They had a smoke together, and they had let the fugitive go. "Oh, you blue caps. Not for nothing do they teach you to keep silent. You must not give in to the human impulse to frankness. You told his story, not in a railroad car, but when you were on assignment at the tree nursery in GULag a year before, and you told it to the prisoners just like that, out of foolishness, and you could never have remembered all the mugs of those who listened to the story. And in all likelihood he had told his story on a train too, more than once. It was the kind of story to tell on trains, and Ch14's bold play was based on that. Joyfully, Chupan went farther along the highway to Chu Station, past the lake and on south. For the most part he traveled at night and hid in the high reeds whenever automobile headlights approached. During the day he lay down in them. There were reed jungles there. There were fewer and fewer operations men about. At that time, the archipelago had not yet cast its metastases into those areas. He had bread and sugar with him, and he made them laugh. And for 5 days he went along without any water at all. After 125 miles of walking, he reached the station and got on a train. And then began his poison years, because Ch14 couldn't risk settling down or staying too long in one place.